Imagine you get a call
Mhm.
from the police and they tell you they think your daughter's death
Wow.
wasn't an accident.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it happened
Mhm.
4 years ago. And to make it even more
Oh my God.
awful,
Yeah.
bossed after, this news comes the day after 9/11. I
Wow.
mean, talk about a day that's etched in everyone's memory
Hard.
for just tragedy. That's what Dawn's mother, Diana Parmalee,
Oh, wow.
had to deal with.
Yeah.
Her daughter, Dawn, died in the fire years earlier.
Okay.
And at the time,
Yeah.
everyone thought it was an accident. But now, years later,
Mhm.
they're saying her husband, Nick Hackney,
Mhm.
and Nick was a youth pastor,
Oh, wow.
very respected in the community,
Right.
that he was being arrested for murder.
It's amazing how a case can just take this wild turn like that, going from accidental fire to a potential homicide investigation, and all because of something new that comes up years later.
Exactly.
It really makes you think about all those seemingly closed cases, how they can be totally reopened when new evidence or even just a new way of looking at things comes to light.
Yeah, and this case really highlights that. Let's go back to the beginning.
Okay.
1998,
Yeah.
the initial investigation pointed to an accident.
Mm-hmm.
They thought maybe some propane tanks
Yeah.
Nick had stored in their bedroom
Mhm.
might have caused the fire. Fast forward 4 years,
Wow.
and a church secretary
Mm-hmm.
named Sandy Glass comes forward,
Okay.
and she's claiming that Nick confessed to her
Oh, wow.
that he killed Dawn. This alleged confession just completely changes the course of the whole case.
Yeah, this is where it gets tricky. So you have this forensic pathologist, right?
Yeah.
He actually changed his opinion about how Dawn died based on what Sandy said to the police.
Really?
At first, he ruled it accidental, but then he changed it to homicide, specifically asphyxiation.
So she suffocated.
Exactly. Which doesn't automatically mean someone did something,
Yeah.
especially in a fire.
Right.
But in this case, it raised some serious red flags.
So now the prosecution has this new cause of death,
Yeah.
but they still have a lot to prove. I mean, and they have
Yeah.
to prove that Nick did this on purpose, but there's no new physical evidence.
Mm-hmm.
So how do they even start to build a case with that?
Well, they had to really lean on Sandy Glass's testimony
Yeah.
and try to figure out a motive, like why would he do this? Their idea was that Nick was having affairs with multiple women from the church, including Sandy,
Okay.
and that he basically wanted out of his marriage.
So the prosecution saying Nick was living this double life,
Yeah.
the respected pastor, but then also hiding these secret relationships. I mean, it's kind of a
Mhm.
classic story of infidelity and deception, but in this case,
Really?
the stakes are incredibly high.
And to add to their theory, they brought up this really interesting piece of evidence. Nick and Sandy had exchanged rings before Dawn died, just like an engaged couple. Yeah. It doesn't definitively prove anything, but it definitely adds to the prosecution's story.
But Nick's defense attorney, Aaron Talladay,
Okay.
wasn't going to just accept this. He really went after Sandy Glass's
Mm.
credibility.
Mhm.
She said she received messages and prophecies from
Yeah.
God, and Talley suggested that she could be
Mhm.
misinterpreting those or even making them up.
He was trying to make the jury question everything.
Yeah.
If they didn't believe Sandy, then her whole testimony about the confession
Yeah.
becomes much weaker. It's a pretty common tactic when a case
Yeah.
depends so much on one person's word.
And I read that Talley used this really interesting analogy during the trial
Oh,
to get his point across. He asked Sandy how she could tell the difference between, like, feeling hungry
Yeah.
and God actually telling her to eat a hamburger.
That's a good one. That really gets to the core of his argument. He's saying that maybe Sandy is mixing up her own desires with messages from God. And if that's true, how can anyone be sure that she's remembering what Nick said accurately, especially when you're talking about a confession to murder? I mean, that's a very
Wow.
emotionally charged situation.
And it makes you wonder, could Sandy have had another reason
Mm,
for accusing Nick? Oh, maybe she was trying to protect herself
right.
because she knew she was involved with him.
Yeah.
Some sources even suggested that she might have gotten some kind of immunity deal in exchange for testifying.
Immunity deals are controversial, but they happen all the time. They let someone who might be involved in the crime testify without being prosecuted themselves.
Mhm.
It's a way for prosecutors to get information,
Mhm.
but it also raises questions about how reliable the witness is,
Mhm.
especially if they have something to gain by accusing someone.
So basically, we have a case where the main witness
Yeah.
might be motivated by saving herself, not just finding justice.
It is hard to know who to believe in a situation like this.
It really makes you question everything that happened that night.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this case so interesting. There are so many layers, You've got conflicting stories, questions about why people did what they did.
Yeah.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing, and others might be in the wrong places.
And to make matters even more complicated,
Hmm.
the defense also went after the whole idea that the fire was arson.
Oh, interesting.
They claimed it was an accident,
Okay.
and they emphasized that there was no evidence proving Nick was even there
Mm-hmm.
when the fire started.
So what were they saying?
They pointed out that he had supposedly left for a hunting trip
Uh-huh.
really early that morning,
Yeah.
saying that means he couldn't have started the fire.
Interesting.
They focused on inconsistencies in the timeline
Mm-hmm.
and questioned whether the prosecution could really prove
Yeah.
that Nick had the opportunity to do it.
Okay.
It's like a battle of the experts at this point.
Yeah.
You have the pathologist who
Yeah.
changed his mind, the defense challenging the fire investigation,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's the whole question of Nick's character.
Yeah.
Like,
Mhm.
do his relationships with other women matter?
Right.
Even his relationship with his mother-in-law, which was
Yeah.
definitely inappropriate.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, are those things relevant to the murder charge?
You've hit on a huge point here. The whole idea of character evidence, it's kind of a gray area in the law. The judge has to decide if this information is helpful
Mm-hmm.
or if it's just going to make the jury biased against the defendant.
So it seems like the prosecution was trying to show that Nick
Yeah.
was a dishonest guy, someone who cheated on his wife,
Mm-hmm.
and that maybe that made him more likely to kill her in a moment of passion.
Okay.
But the defense argued that his personal life shouldn't be used
Right.
to decide whether he's guilty of murder.
It's a classic back and forth. You see this a lot in trials, especially when it's about motives and relationships. It makes you think about how much someone's past should matter when you're trying to figure out if they committed a specific crime.
And in the middle of all this legal debate,
Mm-hmm.
you have Don's mother,
Mm-hmm.
Diana Parmalee. She made this really emotional statement
Yeah.
about how this whole thing had shaken her faith.
It's a powerful reminder that this isn't just about laws and evidence. This is about real people whose lives are shattered. They're dealing with grief, betrayal, and loss of trust in
Mhm.
people they thought they knew. It's really heartbreaking.
It's a reminder that every case we hear about
Right.
affects real people in profound ways.
Mm.
And sometimes, even when
God.
there's a verdict, it can't heal those wounds.
Absolutely.
So we've laid out the groundwork for this really complicated case,
Mm-hmm.
but there's so much more to explore. Next time, we're going to dive into the impact on the church,
Mm-hmm.
the jury's decision, and what happened after the trial.
It'll be interesting to see how it all unfolded.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
Sounds good.
So far, we've been focusing a lot on the legal stuff.
Right.
But let's talk about how this whole thing affected the church community.
Yeah.
I mean, this wasn't just a crime. It was a scandal. It really shook their
Yeah.
faith to the core.
I mean, the church is supposed to be a safe place, a
Mhm.
place where people can find comfort and support,
Exactly.
especially after something like Dawn's death. But here it is, the center of this terrible controversy. It's hard to imagine how betrayed they must have felt.
And one thing that really struck me
Yeah.
is that nobody from the church came forward at first with any suspicions about Nick. Why do you think that was?
Well, there could be a few reasons. Maybe some people truly believed it was an accident, Never even considered that it could be something else. Or maybe some did have suspicions, but were afraid to say anything.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Maybe out of loyalty to Nick, or maybe they were worried about causing more pain for the family, or maybe even about what it would mean for the church.
It makes you think about power dynamics, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Nick was a leader, a pastor, someone people looked up to.
Right.
It can be really hard to speak out against someone like that,
It can be really hard.
especially in a religious setting.
Definitely. And don't forget about the shame and stigma. If anyone suspected an affair, they might not want to say anything,
Yeah.
worried about what would happen to them, to the church.
It raises a bigger question about how institutions,
Yeah.
especially religious ones,
Right.
handle accusations against someone in a position of power. It's like,
It's tough work.
how do you balance the need to hold people accountable
Yeah.
with protecting the community from further harm?
There's no easy answer. It's a real balancing act. But I think being open and honest and really trying to find the truth, Even if it's uncomfortable, that's essential. Like, ignoring things or trying to cover them up, that just causes more pain and distrust
Yeah.
in the long run.
Now let's talk about the trial itself.
Okay.
The jury spent 4 days deliberating
Wow, that's a long time.
before they reached a verdict. What do you think they're struggling with?
Well, they had a huge responsibility. They had to figure out what happened that night and decide if the prosecution had proven Nick's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the standard in these cases. And it's a very high bar.
So even if they had some doubts about Nick,
Yeah,
they couldn't convict him unless those doubts were completely unreasonable.
exactly. They had to weigh all the evidence, all the different stories, consider if Sandy Glass was believable, if the forensic evidence made sense, if the defense's explanations were plausible. Plus, there's the emotional side. This is about a pastor accused of murdering his wife.
It's a heavy burden.
It really is. It must have been so hard to reach a decision, especially a unanimous one.
And how much do you think they considered the fact that there was no physical evidence connecting Nick to the crime?
That's a big one. The lack of a smoking gun, so to speak, that definitely played a role in their decision. The prosecution was relying a lot on circumstantial evidence, which can be strong.
Right.
But it also leaves room for different interpretations. The defense probably argued that this lack of direct evidence created reasonable doubt.
And then there's Sandy Glass.
Right.
How do jurors evaluate someone who claims to hear messages from God?
That's a tricky one. It's hard to be objective about something like that. The defense tried to use that to their advantage. They painted Sandy as maybe unstable or even manipulative. They basically said she couldn't be trusted because her view of reality was distorted.
So we have a key witness who's maybe not reliable.
Yeah.
And no physical evidence linking the defendant to the crime.
It's no surprise it took them so long to decide. They were trying to make sense of a very messy situation.
And that's kind of the point of our legal system, isn't it?
In a way, yeah. It's not always about finding the absolute truth. It's about looking at the evidence and deciding if it meets that legal standard for a conviction. And in this case, the jury decided it didn't.
So what happened? What was the verdict and how did people react?
Well, after those 4 long days, the jury found Nick Hackney not guilty of all charges. People in the courtroom gasped. Some cried. It was a mix of relief and disbelief.
I bet it was a surreal moment.
It was a very emotionally charged case. So much was at stake. And then suddenly, it was over.
But of course, it's not really over, is it?
No, not really. The verdict answers the legal question, but it doesn't erase the pain or answer all the questions.
And people had very different reactions to the verdict.
Of course. Some felt justice was served. Others felt like Nick had gotten away with murder. That's what happens. In cases like this, they're controversial. They leave people with unresolved feelings and different opinions, even with a jury decision. It doesn't always bring closure or feel like justice was done.
And for Dawn's family, it must have been devastating.
I can't imagine.
They lost their daughter, and now the person they believed responsible
Right.
wouldn't be held accountable.
It's a terrible situation. They fought for justice, relived the trauma, and in the end, it felt unfinished.
It shows how the legal system, while important,
Absolutely.
can't always provide that emotional resolution that victims' families need.
It also highlights how differently people can see things, how we judge. We can look at the same evidence and come to different conclusions.
Right.
There's always an element of subjectivity in a trial.
So the trial is over, but the story isn't.
No, it's not.
There's the aftermath, how this all affected the community and the individuals involved.
That's what we'll talk about next time. The lasting impact, the unanswered questions, the search for meaning in the face of tragedy and uncertainty.
So we've spent this deep dive really digging into this case.
Yeah, a lot of layers to unpack.
And Nick Hackney.
Oh,
And it goes so much deeper than just the courtroom.
absolutely.
It really gets to the heart of a community dealing with faith, betrayal, and this really profound sense of loss.
And even though the trial is over,
Yeah.
the healing and the search for answers, I mean, that continues.
Exactly. Let's go back to the church community.
Okay.
They were deeply affected by all of this. What happened to the church after?
What was a turning point for them? This church was once this bedrock of faith and stability, but it was changed forever. Some people actually found their faith strengthened by this whole thing. They saw it as a test.
Wow.
But others felt betrayed, disillusioned. They struggled to reconcile what happened with their beliefs.
And the sources mentioned that quite a few people actually left the church
Right.
after the trial.
Yeah.
It seems like this whole situation with Nick Hackney
Yeah.
created this ripple effect of doubt.
It makes sense. People start questioning everything, not just Nick, but the whole institution of the church.
Right. And we see this a lot, don't we?
Unfortunately.
When a trusted figure, especially a religious leader,
Right.
is accused of something awful, it undermines their authority,
Mhm.
and people start to question what's true, what's right.
They question who they can believe in.
It raises this bigger question about how we deal with these accusations,
It's a big one.
especially within institutions. Should there always be this presumption of innocence?
Mm-hmm.
Or do these cases need a different approach, especially when it's someone
It's tricky.
with a lot of power and influence?
There's no easy answer. You have to protect the rights of the accused. But also think about potential victims and maintaining trust. It's a tough line to walk.
And the church had to navigate that.
They did. And it clearly had a lasting impact.
And thinking about Dawn's family,
Yeah.
they'd already lost their daughter. And then they go through the trial,
Right.
only for Nick to be acquitted. I can't imagine how painful that must have been.
It's unimaginable. The grief, the anger, the feeling that justice wasn't served. They wanted closure, and the legal system just couldn't give them that.
It really highlights that sometimes the
Yeah.
law and our emotional need for resolution,
Mm.
they just don't line up.
And we talked about Diana Parmalee's statement.
Right, about losing faith not in God, but in humanity.
Those were powerful words.
Really powerful.
She captured that feeling of disillusionment, of broken trust.
It's something a lot of people can relate to, I think.
Absolutely.
This case has taken us on quite a journey.
It has
So many twists and turns, so many difficult questions.
a lot to think about.
What are your final thoughts? What do you think are the key takeaways here?
I think this case goes beyond just the specifics of the crime. It shows how complicated people are, how hard it is to find the truth. Sometimes even when you're looking for justice, you don't get the answers. And I think it reminds us to be empathetic, to understand how these events affect everyone involved.
It's been a fascinating deep dive,
It had.
but also really unsettling. It makes you think about how easily trust can be broken
Yeah.
and how long the effects of tragedy can last.
It's a story that stays with you, for sure. Makes you question things, faith, evidence, how we navigate a world where we don't always have all the answers.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Nick Haffney case.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you'll continue to think about the questions we've raised
There's a lot to
and
discuss.
share your thoughts with us. And be sure to subscribe to the deep dive
Yeah.
for more explorations of real-life stories that challenge our perspective.
And make us think a little deeper.
We'll see you next time.